Hey everybody, it's Lindsay with High Altitude Astrology, and today I'm going to be reading the chart of Lance Armstrong. If you don't know who he is, he was a cyclist who won the Tour de France 7 times, starting back in the 90s, and it came to be revealed that he was taking drugs in order to enhance his performance, and eventually was stripped of all of his medals from that particular event. This happened over the course of the 2000s, but he didn't really admit to it until 2013. And he then fell from grace, so to speak. But now in 2018, he seems to be having a revival of sorts. So I wanted to understand from his chart what happened then and what's going on now that is sort of bringing things full circle for him. So if you want to follow along, Lance Armstrong was born on September 18th, 1971 in Plano, Texas. But we do not have a birth time, so I'm working off of a solar chart with the sun conjunct the ascendant. So if we look at his natal chart, we can see right away that he's an intense guy. He has a sun at 24 degrees of Virgo, and it's conjunct Pluto at 29 degrees of Virgo. And if we think about that, Virgo is the sign of health. It also deals with our work, but it is about honing and getting very specific and cleansing. So this makes sense to me that he chose cycling as a profession because it is about performance and about working and about really honing one's skill to become very good at what you do. And of course, it's health oriented. But Pluto there next to the sun, Pluto is about passion, and Pluto's about drive. And Pluto can even have a quality of like compulsiveness and obsessiveness. And you definitely need some of that energy if you're going to become very good at an athletic especially. It's like you have to be driven to do it all the time and to get really, really good at it. He's also got Venus at 0 degrees of Libra in a conjunction with that Pluto at 29 degrees of Virgo and that Sun. It's an out of sign conjunction, but it is a conjunction and it creates a stellium between the Sun, Pluto, and Venus. And I can see that perhaps that brings that Plutonian drive into his desire to make money, his desire to be creative. It could mean that he could be very resourceful when it comes to money and creativity, because Pluto can bring in other people's resources and our ability to connect with others and work with others in order to accomplish our goals. Now, what's also interesting about his chart is that he has a Mars at 12 degrees of Aquarius, and it is part of a grand trine with Saturn at 6 degrees of Gemini and Uranus at 12 degrees of Libra. So Mars in Aquarius trined Saturn in Gemini. This too is going to give him a lot of natural drive. Mars deals with our physical body. It deals with our energetic output, our strength, our drive. And it trines in his chart Saturn. Saturn is also a planet that is symbolic of our work, and it brings discipline. It brings the ability to really kind of do things repetitively so that we can become good at something as well. So we've got Mars, the action, assertive energy, trining, harmonizing with Saturn, the planet of work and effort and discipline. So that really helped him in this career that he chose. Then we've got Uranus creating the third part of this grand trine in his chart. And Uranus has to do with spontaneity and insightful thinking. It could have just, brought new ways into his way of operating, new ways into his way of going about doing what he did. Whether that would be just in like ways of him figuring out how to do what he does in a better way. In his chart, Mercury is at 8 degrees of Virgo. Now, Mercury is what's called his star of destiny because he is a Virgo, and every sign is ruled by a planet, and Virgo is ruled by Mercury. So whenever we look at the star of destiny planet in a chart, it takes on more significance, whatever aspects it carries or wherever its placement is, or when transits or progressions or solar arcs are happening to that particular planet. It just becomes more significant. And in his chart, his Mercury squares his Saturn in Gemini. Mercury in Virgo squared Saturn in Gemini. In some ways, perhaps this helped him because this could bring on somebody who has a very serious mind. So somebody who is always challenged in some ways by their mind, because Mercury in Virgo wants to figure things out and wants to look at things with a fine-tooth comb, going over things with a fine-tooth comb, finding where the problems or the issues are and trying to work them out. That's just Mercury in Virgo naturally. But Saturn brings it's not satisfied with things, especially when it's in square to Mercury. It too sees the flaws more easily. And it could sometimes bring a heaviness or a darkness or a depressive kind of outlook on things. And so that in some ways may have been kind of like a driving force behind him at times, where he just wasn't satisfied enough with himself and kept wanting to push himself further and further and further. Now, what's also interesting is that this Mercury and Saturn is part of a T-square in his chart. He has Jupiter at 0 degrees of Sagittarius conjunct Neptune at 0 degrees of Sagittarius. And those planets both square his Mercury at 8 degrees of Virgo, and they oppose his Saturn at 6 degrees of Gemini. So he's got a T-square here in his chart. And let's just go back to what the Jupiter and Neptune conjunct in Sagittarius symbolize. This is actually a very kind of optimistic perspective kind of person, because Jupiter deals with our philosophies and how we want to expand our world. And Neptune has a spiritual, empathetic, compassionate energy to it. And so combined, the two really do bring a part of him that's able to kind of look at the bright side of things, especially in the sign of Sagittarius. Sagittarius is ruled by Jupiter, so his Jupiter is very comfortable in the sign of Sag, and it is extremely optimistic, extremely forward-thinking, and wants to always find the silver lining in things. And then with Neptune there, it brings more of a, like I said before, a spiritual or compassionate energy blending with that Jupiterian energy. But again, that energy opposes his Saturn in Gemini. And then all of those energies square his Mercury in Virgo. So to me, this suggests that he just would kind of go back and forth between sometimes being able to see the bright side of things and then sometimes being driven by this part of him that never feels like what he's doing is enough, or has a critical perspective on himself at times. And with the T-square, it's just an energy that we're constantly having to kind of face and work through in our life until we figure out a way for these energies to operate more more fluidly together. I would also say that perhaps that Jupiter-Neptune squaring as Mercury maybe was the part of him that allowed himself to kind of not tell the truth about what was going on. He he got kind of swept up into something that was happening in his sport. He certainly wasn't the only person doing it. And in fact, the way that I understand it, you kind of had to do it in order to succeed. Or at least to compete at the level that the people who were doing it were competing at. So I see this Jupiter-Neptune, it's the ability to perhaps excuse sometimes, the truth or the reality of things, because Neptune has this way of creating confusion or allowing us to kind of rationalize in strange ways. And then especially squaring that Mercury, even though it was Mercury in Virgo, you would think Mercury in Virgo would actually be more interested in sort of abiding by the truth. But with Neptune squaring that Mercury, and with Jupiter there sort of just expanding and even exaggerating the Neptunian energy, that may have been one of the things that allowed him to go along with things. But going back to his sun, as a Sun-Pluto person, it makes us kind of like a Scorpio. And because Pluto rules the sign of Scorpio. So that may have given him the ability to also sort of keep the truth down, keep the truth hidden in his own unconscious, or just, from other people knowing about it. Okay, let's move on to some of the transits that were happening when all of this, was revealed. Because what happened was in 2013, January of 2013, he went on Oprah and he confessed, because some of his teammates had been already telling the truth, and he decided that it was time for him to do the same. And there was a lot going on in his chart at that time. One of the things that was going on in 2013 for him was that transiting Pluto was trining his Mercury. And again, Mercury being a star of destiny, transiting Pluto was at 9 degrees of Capricorn, and his natal Mercury is also at 9 degrees of Virgo, 8 degrees of Virgo. But Pluto was moving back and forth, making a trine to that Mercury. And I would say at that time, Pluto was urging him, not only Pluto, I mean, the story was coming out from other people, but he was in some ways being forced to confront that part of him that had kept the truth hidden. Pluto wants to reveal, Pluto wants to transform us. It's not always an easy process, but it definitely is a time where we can face things, and that's exactly what happened for him. Some people were being critical of the way that he appeared on the video with Oprah. But boy, what a really hard thing to have to face publicly. And I would also say that if you listen to him on any more current videos, like he did a podcast with Joe Rogan a couple of years ago, he has definitely looked at this issue very deeply in himself. He has gone through therapy, and he has worked, at making amends with other people in his life who were affected, and with his family. And he really seems like he took the opportunity to go very deep and to look at, what had happened, and to create, to start the healing process for himself and for others. Some other things that were going on in his chart at that time is that transiting Neptune was squaring his natal Neptune. So his natal Neptune is at 0 degrees of Sagittarius, as I mentioned before, and transiting Neptune was hanging around, squaring his natal Neptune. It was at about 1 degrees Pisces when this interview came out. And if you study astrology, you know that the Neptune square Neptune transit is part of what people experience during what you might call our midlife crisis, or the time of midlife. There are a few longer term transits that we go through at that time, and this Neptune squared Neptune is one of them. And I wanted to read something from healinguniverse.com about the Neptune square Neptune time. And this says, occurring at age 40 or 41, this transit provokes contradictions, confusions, forces us to deal with our dreams and big difficulties in concentration. Neptune's hallmark is to unsettle our basic ego through confusion and the revelation that what we thought was real is not. Neptune can make you feel as though you are nothing and have nothing. You begin to question yourself, your motives, your beliefs, your goals, and your reason for existing. So you can see just from that little description that it was beginning to perhaps dissolve his attachment to his ego and all that he had built up in trying to defend himself and defend this lie up until that point. It was forcing him to kind of let go and face things and do things differently. And again, it was setting off that T-square in his chart with that Jupiter-Neptune conjunction opposite of Saturn and squaring his natal Mercury. So, it was stimulating that energy, that conflicting energy in him that struggled with the truth, and really getting it out there. He also was going through a few other transits. He had transiting Jupiter conjunct his Saturn. And his Saturn natally is at 6 degrees of Gemini, and transiting Jupiter at that time was going back and forth across his natal Saturn. From astromatrix.org, they say about the Jupiter conjunct Saturn energy by transit is that it's a time where you will have to deal with your own restrictions and inhibitions. The result of this is that you may feel like you want to grow and break free from these restrictions or somehow grow within the structures of your current life. So again, another symbol with Saturn being limitation and contraction, but it's also how we build foundation. And Jupiter was going over it and expanding it. It's only there once every 12 years. So it was urging him to take this step forward and to create new foundations and to, again, just, do things differently. And once again, it was stimulating that T-square in his chart between Saturn opposing Jupiter and Neptune and squaring his natal Mercury. And the last transit I want to mention that was happening at that time is that transiting Saturn was sextiling his Mercury. And again, another boost, because Mercury being a star of destiny, Mercury in Virgo, getting the details straight, how we communicate, being sextile by Saturn, Saturn being the teacher, Saturn being authority, Saturn being how we build foundation. It was probably just helping urge him again to grow and to try and, fix, what had been done. So now I want to find out what's currently going on in his chart, because he's had definitely a renaissance of sorts. And I want to read something from CNBC, because they talk about what's currently happening in his life. And this is dated July 22nd this year. And it's titled Lance Armstrong's Latest Feat Returning to Public and Corporate Favor. Because he lost big time, all of his corporate sponsors after he confessed. And really his whole life just totally changed. And interestingly, this makes me think of Jupiter on that Saturn, because he had to learn how to kind of get by with a lot less than he had before. And he talks about it on the Joe Rogan podcast, saying, once he decided to just pare everything down, which I would say would be a Jupiter conjunct Saturn energy, he learned that he could still be happy. He still found happiness in his life without all of the accoutrements that being famous and having won all these titles had brought him. So back to the article. It says Lance Armstrong has been building a media content and event organizing business over the last 2 years. Armstrong told CNBC that he expects, quote, The Move, which is his podcast, that started, by the way, in June of 2016, which would have been basically 2 years ago, that he expects it to bring in between $700,000 and $1 million over the course of the 3-week Tour de France. And the podcast had 5 million downloads during the 2017 Tour de France. So we can see that he's coming back to life, so to speak. And if we look at his his current chart, well, let me first mention, if we look at in 2016, when he started that podcast, he had transiting Jupiter conjuncting his Uranus, and his Uranus is at 12 degrees of Libra, and it's part, again, of that grand trine that I mentioned earlier with his Mars at 12 degrees of Aquarius and Saturn at 6 degrees of Gemini, Saturn being his work. So Jupiter was moving over this Uranus for the first time in 12 years in 2016, and I would say it was bringing some sort of unexpected luck, unexpected change and growth, in his life. And I would say that this energy was attributed to why his podcast came about. And now this year, he's currently having a couple of transits. He's having transiting Chiron trine his Jupiter and Neptune conjunction, which to me, transiting Chiron in Aries is trining Jupiter and Neptune in Sagittarius in his chart. And Chiron in Aries, that can be the wounded healer around self-worth, because Aries deals with the self. It's the first sign of the zodiac. It's symbolic of springtime. And it has that flavor or that energy of bursting forth with our self and our confidence and our drive. And to have your wound in Chiron, or have Chiron in Aries right now, it's collectively encouraging all of us to look at that part of ourselves that might have a wound around self-worth, but also how we can be that wounded healer archetype, how we can share with others about healing from the wounded nature around self-worth. And this is trining his Jupiter conjunct Neptune in Sag. And Jupiter-Neptune, I haven't mentioned this yet, but to me, it can really be symbolic of somebody who has a lot of wisdom to share. Jupiter is about that teacher energy. It's higher perspective, and Neptune can be that energy infused with compassion. And then in Sag, it's like, hey, let's all look at how we can expand and grow and look at things with a more positive light. So I feel that transiting Chiron trining in Aries, trining that Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in Sag is currently kind of helping him be that wounded healer teacher type that can help uplift others. And with this podcast, they're talking about the Tour de France, and they're talking about cycling. So it's not so much about his personal journey back to feeling confident, but he's out there doing something now, and I more than he ever has before. And so I feel that this Chiron and Aries trining his Jupiter-Neptune conjunction is a reflection of that. And the last thing I want to mention that's going on currently is that transiting Jupiter is also squaring his Mars. So transiting Jupiter is moving now through the sign of Scorpio at around 13 degrees, and his Mars is at 12 degrees of Aquarius. And Mars in Aquarius, let's think about that for a moment, because that is really, in some ways, somebody who does assert themselves in humanitarian ways. And even though he did, do something very devious and lied about what was happening, a lot of very wonderful things came out of his success as a Tour de France winner. He started the Live Strong, I believe it's called the Live Strong Foundation, where he basically raised money for cancer survivors, because he himself went through a bout of cancer during all of his winning. And to me, that Mars in Aquarius is reflection of somebody who does want to assert themselves in ways that takes in the concern for society, for humanity. So right now, Jupiter is squaring that Mars in Aquarius. And again, Jupiter is about expansion, but in Scorpio, it's about expanding through transforming, and it's squaring that Mars in Aquarius in his chart. So usually Jupiter transits are positive. The square may bring some sort of challenge that he's having to face. And of course, Jupiter in Scorpio, maybe the challenge is coming with really, again, having to face in the public eye, you know, where he's come from and the things that have happened. But he seems to be in a place where he is able to do that more than ever before. And at the same time, in this process with Mars and Aquarius, you know, he can continue to kind of bring out a perspective and assert himself in ways that that helps humanity or helps the group. So this has been my chart interpretation of Lance Armstrong. And if you like my channel, please subscribe. You can also find me on Facebook at High Altitude Astrology. I do have a website where I offer astrological services, and it's highaltitudeastrology.com. You can also reach me there for any inquiries. I'd love to hear from you. And I just want to thank you so much for supporting me and for watching this channel. I really appreciate it. All your comments inspire me very much, and I appreciate that as well. Take care. Adios.